In our first session on Islam, we saw that Muhammad the Prophet instituted Islam as a religion and conquered the Arabian Peninsula, which is basically modern-day Saudi Arabia. After he came, there were four major caliphates of Islam. Now, a caliphate is the major world empire of Islam. And from Muhammad's time right after his death until the World War I in 1924, we have four consecutive caliphates. Each caliphate had their own series of leaders within them. Now, if we look at the Rashidun Caliphate, it ran from 632 to 661. Muhammad conquered the Arabian Peninsula, which is the very deep red color here we have at the bottom. Rashidun Caliphate expanded to northern Africa, up towards Eastern Europe, and the Asia Minor continent here, as you can see. And from 661 to 750, the Umayyad Caliphate, which is the yellowish color here, expanded to the rest of northern Africa, up into Europe here. As you can see, Spain and Portugal and the south of France falling, as well as territory headed towards the Indian continent over here. The first caliph, or world leader, after Muhammad's death, was Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr was the founder of the Sunni tribes of Israel. There's basically two divisions within Islam, and that is Sunni and Shiite. And the Sunnis descend from the very first ever caliph to take over from Muhammad. After Muhammad was a man named Umar, and after Umar was a man named Uthman, and then finally the fourth and last caliph of the Rashidun Caliphate was Ali. Ali was a direct cousin of Muhammad, and he founded the Shiite branch of Islam. So this is what the Islamic Empire looked like up until the Middle Ages. Now, what's interesting is, if you look at the history of Islam, the spread of Islam is very similar to the spread of both the Alexander the Great's empire, the Mongols' empire of Genghis Khan, Roman Empire, any other empire built on military conquest. There was very little overall in the way of missionary work and winning the hearts of people one heart at a time. It was basically a military empire. The Muslim world dominated militarily from its inception until its full growth of all of its massive borders by the 1920s. One thing that benefited the spread of Islam was the fact that it occupied as its central base the keystone between Europe, Africa, and the Asian world. And a lot of the major trade routes had to go through the Arabian Kingdom, and so they could control a certain amount of commercial power and had their fingers in the academic knowledge of the world as they cross-hybridized. Now, the Islamic world was filled with non-Muslims, and they were referred to as dhimmis. And dhimmis were effectively second-class citizens. If you were a second-class citizen, a non-Muslim within the Muslim empire, you were heavily taxed. You were also forbidden to convert Muslims out of their religion. You were forbidden to wear symbols of your own religion. You couldn't have a public place of worship for your religion. And if you did so, you would risk the death penalty or some other form of heavy penalization. The Muslim world first came into contact with lots of Jews and Christians when they spread into Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. Now, Damascus fell in 635, Iraq fell in 637, and Jerusalem finally fell in 638. And the first Dome of the Rock was built in 691, right at the Temple Mount where the Solomon's Temple had previously resided before it was destroyed in AD 70 by the Roman conquest. The Covenant of Umar is often related back to Umar, who was the second caliph after Muhammad's death. And this document lists the protocol for the Muslim world on how to treat the non-Muslims living within its borders. And as we saw with the dhimmis earlier on, this was a very heavy-handed approach, which is very, very similar to the modern-day Saudi Arabian protocol for non-Muslims. So you could not have a public place of worship, you could not express your religion if it was not that of Islam, and if you refused to convert, you were heavily taxed, to the point where many people within the Islamic Empire converted just from the financial pressure. There was no heart-to-heart conversion method, as we see, for example, in the first 300 years of Christianity within the Roman Empire, where people were persecuted for being Christian, but Christianity spread nonetheless. This was the reverse. And I say it's very similar to Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan, any other conquering empire where they put military or financial pressure on you to follow their lead. Saudi Arabia employs a very similar system in which they have religious police enforce Sharia law onto a population. Because even within Islamic world, people don't naturally desire or convert to behaving in the way it's prescribed, there has to be a heavy-handed pressure to force conformity. One of the turning points during the spread of Islam was the Battle of Poitiers, in which the European world started to push back against Islamic expansion. The Abbasid Caliphate had lost both Spain and Portugal and parts of northern Africa. The Reconquista of Spain was a pushback from the Christian world, which effectively moved the Muslim Moors out of Spain and back into the African continent. This was the third major caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and it's been often considered the golden age of the Islamic empires. And this was because there was a retraction of military effort and a concentration on the accumulation of knowledge. Because of its central positioning between Europe, Asia, and Africa due to trade routes, the Islamic world also had access to the trading of academic information, and they translated those into an Arabic dialect and were able to expand greatly and even contribute to worldwide knowledge. The age of the Crusaders also occurred during the Abbasid Caliphate. The timeline typically given to the Crusades is from 1095 to 1298, and we'll discuss this in our part 3 of our series. The fourth and final caliphate of Islam occurred between the 1200s and World War I, 1924, and it was called the Ottoman Empire. And as you can see, even though they never reconquered the Spanish and Portugal regions, they did retake northern Africa, and they expanded northward and westward, and it overtook modern Greece and parts of Eastern Europe, and they even touched parts of China, Russia, as well as spread eastward into the Philippines and Southeast Asian continent, the Indian continent, and so forth. During 1940s, the Hindu and Muslim conflicts around the Indian continent came to a head, and the Pakistani nationality was born in an effort to separate Indian Hindus from Indian Muslims. And today we have a majority Muslim country in Pakistan as a result. And here's a current map of the Muslim spread throughout the world as it is pretty much today. The darker brown colors are the heavier concentrations of Muslim populations, and the lighter colors show a Muslim dominance but in lessening degrees. And as you can see, majority of Africa and the Middle East continue to be Muslim dominated, as well as Southeast Asia. One thing you'll often run into is the idea that the Jews also used conquest to spread through the Promised Land. Therefore, what makes them different from, let's say, the Islamic world or any other world conquering empires? Now, there are some significant differences. In the world of Islam, the jihadi protocol of conquering is open-ended and universal. It never is to end. As a matter of fact, one of the stated goals of the Quran and the Hadith is to form a worldwide caliphate over the entire globe. That is the method of expansion. It is open-ended and never-ending within the Islamic world. In the Jewish world, there is no such open-ended universal protocol. Proof of that is if you look at Jewish history, it's only taken a certain very small chunk of land. It's less than 0.1% of the Middle East, and it has never had a history of never-ending, ongoing conquering. And it is not prescribed within their scriptures. Within the Bible, there are instances in which God did ask very specifically for certain people groups to be wiped out by Israel, but there was always a series of protocol. Number one was total depravity. There's scriptures in which God says, Israel needs to wait for the Amorites, for example, to reach total depravity before they can move in. And total depravity included for the Amorites, as well as the Jebusites, Hivites, and Canaanites in the area, was Molech worship, in which a statue was heated up to red hot and live children were sacrificed on it, burnt alive. So when a society became so depraved that they needed to be stopped, God did put Israel in there. Another protocol was with if nations were continually attacking Israel with no just cause. As a matter of self-defense, God did call on the Amalekites to be wiped out for Israel's safety. The Amalekites also had been subsequently totally depraved as well, fulfilling condition number 1 that we just looked at. Condition number 3 is the societies refused to repent. As we saw with Sodom and Gomorrah and the Ninevites during Jonah's time, God desired even nearly or close to totally depraved cultures to repent, and if they did, he would spare them. His standards was quite low. He just wanted a certain amount of people within those societies to repent. If they were totally depraved, if they were a danger to Israel, and if they refused to repent, God would single them out as needing to be taken out. Another cause for Israel's genocide of certain people groups was if they fulfilled the first 3 conditions and they were not taken out, there was a danger that they would seduce Israel, as they often did, as we read in the Old Testament, into things such as Molech worship or other atrocities that God did not want Israel to fall into. Now, the destruction of these countries also stood as a warning to other countries who could otherwise have slipped into the same type of behavior, and it served as a deterrent to the ancient world. One objection people have to those above conditions is that wouldn't there still be innocent adults and children within those societies? Now, that is very difficult to say. When a society is so depraved, can there be any adults within those societies that are not caught up in that lifestyle to that degree? We do know that children, according to the Bible, are not considered sinful until they have reached a more mature age. And children brought in a depraved culture overwhelmingly tend to grow up to fall into that lifestyle. By eliminating that culture as a whole, God would spare the souls of those children and prevent them from growing up to be depraved, eternally damned, and part of an ongoing cycle of needless violence and depravity. So this ends our section on the spread of Islam throughout its 4 major caliphs after Muhammad's death. In our next section, we will deal with the Crusades and look at them in detail. Thank you for joining us.